Hey everyone, I'm Jay and welcome to an example video about tables. Let's get started. This is the second part in my video about tables. The first part I went through a slideshow and basically described all about tables. Now this video we're actually going to look at the code of this amazing table that I have built right here. I'm sure that you're just in awe of how cool this table is. And but it does have, I think, all of the settings that we talked about already in place so that we can have a look at them in action. All right, so first thing I want to point out is that I don't have any attributes set on my table. In the previous video, I talked about how most of the table attributes have been deprecated over the years, and so I'm not using any of them. I did have to use one specific line of CSS in order to overcome one of the previous attributes that used to be an attribute. Now it's deprecated, but the default behavior wasn't what I wanted it to be. So I did have to overcome that with CSS to get the default behavior that I prefer. And then all the rest of the CSS was just basically colors so that we can see everything. All right, I'm a big fan of just using bright, obnoxious colors in my initial settings so I can clearly see what's going on. And so that's what I have here. So I'm going to take a look at the HTML side first so that when we do look at the CSS, we'll know what it's referencing, right? So I have my table and I have set an ID to my table, my dash table, all lowercase. I like to use an ID for a table, although if I'm working on a website that has a lot of tables, I will of course use a class. But if I'm making one specific table, it's going to be an ID. Then I have the caption. Of course, I just called it my table again. Super clever, right? Caption does need to come first within the table, so remember that. I did not set anything special on the caption, so it is at the top of the table. I could set it at the bottom, but I just left it the way the default is set. So I have a call group next. That should be the next thing after the caption, and I have one for each of my columns. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, including a header column. I just named them appropriately, col 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, giving them the class names, and I do have CSS for each of those, which we will see. Generally, I just gave them a background color. You'll see the alternating colors in CSS and how I did that as well. Next, I have a T head, followed by a T body and a T foot. So the T head has one row. Don't forget to put a row in your head. The head itself does not count as a row. You have to put that row. The first column in the head I left blank because I have a row of headers and a column of headers. So this corner one, both at the top and the bottom, I intentionally made it to be blank because nothing really belongs there, not at this table. You may build a table where you have something there. It's an optional place for you to put a caption if you don't want to use the actual caption, since no data actually goes there, not generally speaking, right? And then I've given each of the th elements an ID, and I've just called them call head 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, keeping it simple. And then I gave the ones that actually are column headers, I gave them a scope of column. And so this is going to help screen readers when they get to a spot, they're going to know, okay, this is a column header. It's a simple table, so it's pretty obvious, and most screen readers will probably still get it. But as you have a more complex table, the scope, and it's either going to be a row or a column scope, it does get more useful as your table gets more complicated. You may have You may have headers mixed into the table somewhere as well. And so this gets really appropriate or really necessary at some point. Okay? And then I just have some text in there, Kyle head, just obvious text, right? Moving, I'm going to skip the body and go down to the foot. Okay, I left the foot basically blank. Okay, this is, I wanted to do the opposite. The header has everything and the foot has nothing. So you can see what that just looks like, just the bare bones syntax of it. So I have my T foot, I have one row in there, don't forget the row, and then a bunch of THs, some text in the ones with text, and then the first one is blank again, just like the header. So this is essentially a copy of the header, although I changed the word from col head to col foot. And then in the foot, I didn't do any of those extra settings like the ID and the scope. All right, I just left those blank. Primarily because it's not a header, it's a footer, right? But also so that you can see just the HTML without any of those attributes. Right? These are the good attributes, scope and ID. ID is always good, and so is class. Okay. Now let's have a look at the body. And generally, every row has 5 columns. The first row is a header row. All right, I could have some text in there that says, like, you know, what the header is. Maybe if this is people information, like employee records or something, the first one might be their ID or their name or something, and then everything so on. Or if it's a list of movies, maybe the first one is the title, and then all the attributes of the movies go in the other ones, whatever's in the list. Okay. So the first column is a header column. It has an ID, right? Just like the headers at the top were column headers, the headers along the left side are row headers, and their scope is row because they head each row. Okay? And then the data in there, I put the headers data in there to say which cell is the header for both the column head and the row head. Of course, my names are appropriately named, easy enough to understand which one I'm talking about. So this is row 1, so the header for the row is always going to be row head 1, and then the column head is going to be 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. You'll notice there's this green element right here that is much bigger, right? It has a column span and a row span, each of 2. I did not set any headers info in the headers attribute for this one, because this one you do have some choices. Because it spans 2 rows and 2 columns, I have the choice, depending on how my data is, to say, okay, which column header is the actual header and which row header is the actual row header for this element. Because it does span more than one, I have the choice to label this in the way that actually fits my data. And so my data is all made up, so I left it blank so that it would remind me to talk about it. But if your data is real, you're going to have to somehow label it in the appropriate way. And then you'll notice in the next, well, in this same row, this element spans 2 columns, so I did not put the next column in there because this one spans, it encapsulates it, so I don't want to put that next column in there. If I were to put that next column in here, to make sure that I have, you know, the same number of columns, right? So I need to have 4 columns. If I did that, now it sticks out, and now my table is kind of wonky. So if you span in anywhere in your rows and columns, make sure that you add up the columns and account for the span. So I'm supposed to have 1 TH and then 1, 2, 3, 4 TDs. Now in this row, I have 1 TH and 1, 2, 3, 4 TDs. One of them spans 2 for a total of 5, and it sticks out right here. So I need to get that out of there. Okay. And now this one is also spanning a row. So when I get down to the next row, I have one th, and then I have two tds, and that's it. If I were to code in the remaining two, and we'll just put that in here. Let's see. Oh. Let's put this in here. Put those two in there and see what happens. Okay, they're gonna stick out the end of that row, right? Because they're in that row, but this column spans down here, and then the other two stick out. Okay, and you notice these don't have a gray background, but they do have alternating gray backgrounds, and you'll see how I did that when we get to the CSS very briefly here. All right, so let's fix that. Remember, whenever you span either rows or columns or both, you need to omit or leave out the other columns that you span into, okay? And if you have a large table, like this one goes along to the edge, so that's fairly easy to just go to the edge. But sometimes you do need to, like, for example, if I put that in a different column, now in this column anyway, I need to make sure that I have this one come after it. And you'll see that all the other ones immediately, they automatically wrap around in the correct places. Right? And if I move it again and make it the first one, all the other ones pop into their correct places. Okay, so when you're doing a row span or a column span, you need to make sure that you omit the correct rows and columns. Okay, now obviously this is incorrect because they're out of alphabetical order now, so I need to put my column element back where it belongs and get everything in the right spot. All right, the rest of the columns and rows have nothing special in them, and they're just more data for me to show you. I made my alphabet almost all the way to Z. Now we can take a look at the CSS. Okay, I have some generic stuff just to code the page itself. Here we get to the table stuff. So initially, I set my table to have a width of 100% because by default, it actually is just going to have the minimum width needed to display the data, right? Which may be a lot of width or it may not be a lot of width, depends on what data is in it, what the content is. So I'm going to set it to 100% so that it fills the available space. And this thing is going to update, right? Why is it not updating? There we go. That'll do. There we go. All right. Some reason CodePen didn't want to update. All right, so the next CSS property that I have is this border spacing. And I did mention there was one specific CSS that I had to set in order to override the default table display. And in olden times, I would have done a cell padding or a cell spacing in order to do this and set that to 0. But those are deprecated, and now I have border spacing is the CSS value. If I leave it blank, this is the default where all of the cells get that little bit of automatic space in between them. And for your tables, this might be what you want it to look like. However, I didn't, and so I put border spacing of 0 in there. And hopefully this is going to update again. I don't know what's wrong with CodePen right now. All right, I'm going to have to just keep an eye on that. So I wanted all of my cells to butt right up against each other. And so that's how I set that. So then I have a lot of individual CSS to go over it, everything. And hopefully I have it in a good order. I have it kind of hierarchical set, right? Hopefully it's in an understandable order for this video. So the first thing I did is I set the header and the footer of my table to have a text color of white and then a background color of a transparent gray. Now, something that you need to be aware of when you're setting background colors for rows and columns and headers and footers and everything is the way the table's background color is set is not the way you might expect it to be set. If I set the background color of a cell, of a table cell or a col group, right, which I've set the col groups here. If I set the col group background color and then I set a row background color, the row will be placed on top of the col group, which is okay as long as we know this up front. So for example, right here, I have all of my every other row, every even numbered row, going to have a background color of a transparent light gray color. And that's what we see right here. If I did non-transparent, and I just wrote gray, it would fully override what's underneath of it. Okay, so I don't want to do that. I want to do a transparent gray in this case so that I can see what's underneath it and I can just get a tinted color. Okay, and so that's why in many of these things I'm using a transparent color. Gray. Okay, so in the headers and the footers, it doesn't matter as much, but I do want to keep my color consistent throughout. So I'm just applying a darker shade to the header and the footer. Okay. Next, I'm giving some padding to the th elements in the head and the foot only. So I'm not giving this padding to the row heads. I'm only giving it to the column heads that are in the head and the foot. Next, I'm setting the first first child in each the head and the foot to have a background color of white, so I can do this. So what I tried to do originally is set background color of none, or maybe I'll set the background color to a fully transparent with nothing in there. But what happens is then I get whatever color is behind it as well, or in front of it as well. So I couldn't just set it to be transparent without getting the color that's associated with it because of the row and the t-head and everything else, because there's a lot of accumulated background colors within a table. You have the table itself, you have the t-head, body, and foot, you have rows, you have columns, a lot of background colors and overlapping of background colors. So sometimes you run into that issue. We went over that one. This is empty. Next, I'm setting all of the THs to have a text color of white. That's a little bit redundant with regard to the head and the foot, but I do want to get my rows to have a background color of, a text color of white. And you'll notice that all of my THs are centered text and bold. That's the default setting. I did not override that. I did not customize that. That's built in. Then my TDs, these are all text align right. By default, I believe they were text align left. Yes, they were text align left, but I kind of wanted to put them to the right. I'm used to doing financial tables when I do work with tables, and I want the money to line up on the right. So the cents and decimal points can line up, right? And then I added a half a EM of padding all the way around. by default, what you're going to get is no padding, right? And of course, it's going to mess my text align. By default, you're going to get no padding. That's how tables work. They give you just enough space and no more. Right? They just wrap tightly around the content. And then the last set right here, I have my call groups. Remember the call groups from the HTML? I have call group call 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I just gave them background colors. You can see the call groups here. And notice, of course, my element that is spanned, it keeps its own background color even though it spans into another column and another row. So it keeps this dark green even though it went into the light green row and even though it went to the cyan column over here. Okay, and that's because it belongs in that one spot, and even if you make it bigger, it still retains whatever its proper background color is supposed to be just for that one spot. It's not going to change at all when it gets into the other spots. All right. And that's all the CSS I have set for this table. Great, that is everything. All right, I'm going to slowly move through the CSS and then the HTML for anyone who wants to take a look, and I will put a link to this code pen in the description. All right, well, that is this table example. Hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.